For Evelyn Reed, a waitress drowning in debt and fading dreams, he was just Mr. Henderson. A perpetually grumpy old man in a threadbare coat who occupied booth 4 every single morning, ordered the same black coffee and dry toast, and never ever left a tip. She knew his scowl better than she knew her own textbooks. But one Tuesday morning, a simple act of kindness, a single cup of coffee paid for out of her own meager tips, would unravel her reality. She had no idea this lonely, cantankerous man was Arthur Pendleton, a reclusive billionaire whose life was a fortress of secrets. And she certainly had no idea that he was about to die, leaving behind a will so shocking it would ignite a war with her, a 24-year-old waitress standing right at the epicenter of the explosion. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a story about how $1.75 can buy you an empire or get you buried. The hiss of the espresso machine was the soundtrack to Evelyn Reed's life. It was a constant steamy punctuation mark in a long run-on sentence of exhaustion. At 6:00 a.m., the Daily Grind diner in Chicago was already humming with the low murmur of early risers, construction workers nursing chipped mugs, bleary-eyed office drones ordering their usual to go, the occasional lost tourist marveling at the authenticity of the slightly sticky vinyl booths. For Evie, it was all a blur of faded aprons, the clatter of ceramic on linoleum, and the perpetual scent of bacon grease and burnt coffee. She was in her 3rd year of a fine arts program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a dream she was paying for one double shift at a time. Her reality wasn't paint-splattered canvases and inspired epiphanies. It was aching feet, student loans that felt like a physical weight on her shoulders, and an apartment so small she had to store her canvases under her bed. She was running on fumes, fueled by cheap coffee and a stubborn refusal to quit. And every morning, like a grim, unmovable clock tower, there was Mr. Henderson. He would shuffle in at precisely 7:15 a.m., his tall frame stooped inside a tweed coat that had seen better decades. He'd slide into booth 4, the one by the window, with the crack in the red vinyl, and place a worn copy of The Wall Street Journal on the table. He never looked up when Evie approached. The usual Mr. Henderson, she'd ask, her voice perpetually cheerful, a stark contrast to his permanent scowl. A grunt was her answer. That meant 1 black coffee hot and 1 order of whole wheat toast, no butter dry. He would nurse that coffee for exactly 1 hour, meticulously, reading every section of the paper, his long, bony fingers tracing the columns of text. He never spoke to anyone, never smiled, and never in the 2 years Evie had worked there left so much as a penny for a tip. Her co-workers avoided him. "Don't waste your breath, Evie," a seasoned waitress named Brenda had told her once. "Old man Henderson is a black hole for kindness. You could give him a winning lottery ticket and he'd complain about the tax." But Evie couldn't help it. There was something in his eyes, a deep, cavernous loneliness that reminded her of the empty canvases she didn't have time to paint. She saw past the gruff exterior to the flicker of something else, something wounded. So she continued to greet him with a smile, to make sure his coffee was fresh and hot, to treat him with the same respect she gave the big tippers. It was a small, pointless act of defiance against the cynicism of the world. This Tuesday in late October was different. The air outside had a biting chill that promised an early winter, and the diner was less busy than usual. Evie was running on 4 hours of sleep, having spent the night cramming for a brutal art history midterm. Her bank account was a desolate landscape, and her rent was due Friday. The pressure was a physical thing, a a tightening in her chest. Mr. Henderson came in at 7:15 a.m., same as always. He grunted his order, and Evie brought him his coffee and toast. She was in the middle of refilling salt shakers when she saw him at the counter trying to pay. He was fumbling through the pockets of his old coat, a strange look of panic briefly crossing his features before being replaced by his usual stony mask. "It seems I've forgotten my wallet," he said, his voice a low rumble of gravel and embarrassment. He wouldn't look at Brenda, who was manning the cash register with an impatient, knowing smirk. "It's $1.75, Henderson," Brenda said, tapping her acrylic nails on the counter. "Same as yesterday." Mr. Henderson's face, usually pale, flushed a deep, mottled red. He looked cornered, humiliated. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his pride warring with his predicament. And in that moment, Evie saw not a grumpy old man, but just a man. A man who was old and lonely, and for whatever reason had found himself in an embarrassing situation. Before she could think, she was moving. "I've got it. I got it, Brenda," Evie said, stepping up to the register. She pulled 2 crumpled dollar bills from her apron pocket, part of the meager $5 in tips she'd made all morning. "It's on me today, Mr. Henderson." Brenda rolled her eyes, but rang it up. Mr. Henderson turned, and for the first time he looked directly at Evie. His eyes, a startlingly sharp blue, were not angry. They were analytical. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the very first time, not as a uniformed dispenser of coffee, but as a person. The intensity of his ichul made her feel strangely transparent. "That isn't necessary," he rasped, his voice stiff. "It's just coffee," Evie said, with a small, tired smile. "Everyone has those days. Don't worry about it." She expected another grunt, maybe a curt nod, before he shuffled out. Instead, he just stood there for a long moment, his blue eyes boring into hers. It felt less like gratitude, and more like an appraisal, a silent weighing and measuring that she couldn't possibly understand. Finally, he gave a single sharp nod. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, using her name for the very first time, and then he turned and walked out the door, the little bell above it chiming his departure. Evie stood there, a strange feeling settling in her stomach. Brenda just shook her head. "You just threw away $2, kid. He'll be back tomorrow expecting a handout." But Mr. Henderson wasn't back tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. An entire week went by, and booth 4 remained empty. The cracked vinyl seat by the window felt like a missing tooth in the diner's familiar grin. Evie found herself looking for the stooped figure in the tweed coat every morning, a knot of worry tightening in her gut. Had he gotten sick? Had something happened to him? The man who had been a fixture, a certainty in her chaotic life, had simply vanished, leaving behind only the memory of his surprising intense gaze and the echo of her name spoken in his gravelly voice. She told herself it was silly to worry about a grumpy stranger, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her small act of kindness hadn't been an ending, but a beginning. She had no idea how right she was. 3 weeks passed. The memory of Mr. Henderson began to fade, buried under the weight of midterm exams, extra shifts to cover the heating bill, and the gnawing anxiety of her ever-present debt. He became another one of the city's ghosts, a brief, strange chapter in her life at the daily grind. Evie passed her art history exam, but only just. The victory felt hollow. She was so tired of surviving, of treading water. Her dream of being an artist felt more distant than ever a speck on a horizon she could no longer see. It was a cold, grey Wednesday afternoon. The lunch rush had subsided, and Evie was wiping down tables her mind 1,000,000 miles away, sketching out compositions on the sticky formica with her wet rag. The bell above the door chimed, but it was a different sound from the usual hurried jingle. It was deliberate, resonant. A man stood there, so out of place he might as well have been beamed down from another planet. He was in his late 50s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a bespoke navy blue suit that probably cost more than Evie's tuition for the semester. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and they seemed to hesitate before stepping onto the diner's worn linoleum floor. He held a sleek leather briefcase in one hand, and his eyes scanned the room with a look of polite professional disdain. Brenda, leaning against the counter, whistled under her breath. "Looks like somebody's lost." The man's gaze swept past the other patrons and landed with unnerving precision on Evie. He walked toward her, his expensive shoes making soft, determined sounds on the floor. "Are you Miss Evelyn Reed?" he asked. His voice was smooth, cultured, and carried an authority that made the hairs on Evie's arms stand up. Yes. That's me," she stammered, clutching her damp rag. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" It was her first thought. A debt collector. A summons for an unpaid medical bill from when she'd sprained her wrist last year. The man offered a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Not at all, Miss Reed. My name is Alistair Finch. I am a senior partner with the law firm of Finch, Covington and Crow." He produced a business card from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table she had just wiped. The card was thick, embossed, the ink a rich, dark blue. "I was the personal attorney for a Mr. Arthur Pendleton." The name meant nothing to her. Pendleton. "I'm sorry. I don't think I know him." Mr. Finch's gaze was patient. "Perhaps you knew him by a different name. An elderly gentleman, tall, fond of tweed coats. He was a regular patron of this establishment. I believe you knew him as Mr. Henderson." Evie's heart did a strange little flip-flop in her chest. Mr. Henderson? So that was his real name. Arthur Pendleton. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Is he okay? I was so worried when he stopped coming in." Alistair Finch's expression softened just a fraction. "Mr. Pendleton passed away 2 weeks ago, Miss Reed. It was peaceful. He had been ill for some time." The news hit Evie with a surprising force. A wave of sadness washed over her. The grumpy old man was gone. She'd never see him scowling over his newspaper in booth 4 again. "I'm so sorry to hear that," she said, her voice quiet. He seemed very lonely." "He was a very private man," Finch said, a master of understatement. "Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. Mr. Pendleton's last will and testament is scheduled to be read this Friday at 10:00 a.m. at our offices. He was very specific in his instructions that you are to be in attendance." Evie stared at him bewildered. "Me? Why, I barely knew him. I just served him coffee." "Mr. Pendleton had his reasons, Miss Reed. Reasons which will be made clear on Friday," Finch replied smoothly, ignoring her confusion. "I am here to formally deliver your summons and to arrange for a car to pick you up. Our offices are downtown in the Aeon Center." The Aeon Center, one of the glittering titans of Chicago's skyline. It was a world away from the daily grind. The whole situation felt surreal, like a scene from a movie. The other customers were now openly staring, their conversations having died down to whispers. I have a shift on Friday, she said weakly, the excuse sounding pathetic even to her own ears. I'm certain your employer will understand, Finch said, glancing briefly at Brenda, who was watching with her mouth agape. Mr. Pendleton's estate will of course compensate you for any lost wages. Generously. The word generously hung in the air, thick with implication. What was going on? Did Mr. Henderson, Arthur Pendleton, leave her something? Maybe $50 as a thank you for the coffee. That seemed plausible. A strange final act from a strange man. It was the only explanation that made any sense. This is crazy, Evie whispered, more to herself than to him. Life often is. Miss Reed, Finch said, his professional mask back in place. A car will be waiting for you outside your apartment building at 9:15 a.m. on Friday. Please be prompt. He gave her one last assessing look. And I would advise you to dress appropriately. His gaze flickered over her faded jeans and sauce-splattered apron. With a curt nod, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The heavy, embossed business card sat on the table, a stark white rectangle in the greasy spoon diner. Evie picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. Finch, Covington, and Crow. Arthur Pendleton. A summons. Brenda finally found her voice. Evie, who the hell was Mr. Henderson? Evie could only shake her head, her mind reeling. I have no idea, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I think I'm about to find out. As she looked out the window, she saw the lawyer, Mr. Finch, get into the back of a black Bentley that had been waiting at the curb, a car so sleek and silent it seemed to absorb the light around it. It pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the city traffic, leaving Evie holding a piece of cardboard that felt like a ticket to another universe. Friday morning arrived with a nervous flutter in Evie's stomach that no amount of coffee could quell. She stood in front of the small, cracked mirror in her bedroom, looking at her reflection with a critical eye. Following Mr. Finch's advice, she had chosen her one good outfit, a simple dark grey dress she'd bought at a thrift store for an art school interview paired with black flats. It was neat and conservative, but she felt like a child playing dress-up. The fabric seemed to scream imposter against the backdrop of what was to come. At precisely 9:15 a.m., the black Bentley from the other day glided to a stop in front of her worn-down apartment building. The driver, a stoic man in a black suit, got out and opened the rear door for her without a word. Sliding onto the plush cream leather felt like entering another dimension. The car smelled of wealth, a subtle clean scent of leather and polish. The city noise faded away to a distant hum as the car moved silently through the streets of Chicago, heading toward the gleaming towers of the Loop. The offices of Finch, Covington, and Crow occupied the entire 80th floor of the Aeon Center. Evie's ears popped in the high-speed elevator. When the doors opened, she was met with a panorama of Lake Michigan, a vast expanse of blue that made her feel dizzy. The reception area was a study in understated power, mahogany walls, abstract art that was undoubtedly original and expensive, and a silence that was broken only by the hushed clicking of keyboards. Alistair Finch met her himself. Miss Reed, thank you for coming. Please follow me. He led her down a long carpeted hallway to a pair of large wooden doors. A word of preparation, if I may, he said, pausing with his hand on the door handle. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. The other beneficiaries are Mr. Pendleton's children, Marcus and Victoria. They can be intense. Arthur's relationship with them was complicated. Whatever happens in this room, try not to be intimidated. Evie's heart pounded against her ribs. Children. Of course he had children. Why hadn't she thought of that? Before she could process his warning, Finch opened the doors and ushered her inside. The conference room was just as opulent as the rest of the office, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the city skyline like a dark lake. Seated at the table were two people who looked as if they had been sculpted from ice. The man Marcus Pendleton was in his late 40s, with his father's sharp blue eyes, but none of the hidden sorrow. His were cold, sharp, and predatory. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, and his face was a mask of impatient arrogance. He looked at Evie's simple dress and thrift store shoes with a barely concealed sneer. The woman, Victoria Pendleton Blackwood, was a few years younger. Her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. She was adorned with pearls and a look of supreme entitlement. She didn't even deign to look at Evie, instead examining her manicured nails as if a speck of dust had more right to be in the room. They were the picture of inherited wealth and privilege. They radiated a cold, hostile energy that made Evie want to shrink. She took the empty seat Finch indicated directly across from them, feeling like a field mouse at a table of eagles. "Alistair, what is the meaning of this?" Marcus snapped his voice, cutting through the silence. "We are here to discuss a multi-billion-dollar estate." "Who is this?" He gestured dismissively at Evie. "This is Miss Evelyn Reed," Finch said calmly, taking his seat at the head of the table. "She is here at your father's explicit written instruction. Now, if we are all settled, I will proceed with the reading of the last will and testament of Arthur Elias Pendleton." Finch donned a pair of reading glasses and opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The air crackled with tension. Victoria finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over Evie with icy disdain before settling back on the lawyer. "I, Arthur Elias Pendleton, being of sound mind and body." Finch began, his voice a steady drone. He went through the preliminaries, the legal jargon that washed over Evie in a meaningless wave. There were several bequests to charities: a children's hospital, an animal shelter, the Chicago Public Library. With each one, Marcus shifted impatiently in his seat. "To my daughter, Victoria Pendleton Blackwood," Finch read, "I leave my collection of 18th century landscape paintings and the sum of $1 million in the hopes that she might one day purchase something of actual taste." Victoria's face tightened at the insult, the backhanded compliment, a clear posthumous jab from her father. $1 million was pocket change to these people. "To my son Marcus Pendleton," Finch continued, "I also leave the sum of $1 million so that he may finally buy a spine and not simply lease one from his board of directors." Marcus's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle jumped in his cheek. His face was a thundercloud of fury. "Is this a joke, Alistair? Where is the rest, the company?" "The estate." Finch held up a hand. "Please allow me to finish." He took a slow, deliberate breath, and his eyes found Evie's across the table. "We now come to the residuary clause, which concerns the remainder of my estate. This includes, but is not limited to, my entire controlling interest in Pendleton Industries. All real estate holdings, including the primary residence in Lake Forest, all stock portfolios, bonds, and liquid assets, the total estimated value of which is—" Finch paused for dramatic effect. "Approximately $4.8 billion. The room was utterly silent. Marcus and Victoria leaned forward, their masks of arrogance replaced by raw, naked greed. This was it. The main event. Finch cleared his throat and read the next line. All the rest residue and remainder of my estate I give devise and bequeath to Miss Evelyn Reed, currently residing at 2451 North Clark Street, Chicago, Illinois. For a moment, the words didn't register. It was as if he'd spoken them in a foreign language. Evelyn Reed. That was her address. But it couldn't be. It was a mistake, a cruel, insane prank. Then chaos erupted. What? Victoria shrieked, jumping to her feet. The sound was shrill, ugly. That is absolutely preposterous. That's impossible. You've got to be kidding me. Marcus roared, slamming his hand on the table, making the water glasses jump. He pointed a trembling finger at Evie, his face contorted with rage. Her a coffee shop waitress. Our father has been declared mentally incompetent. He was a senile old fool. And this tramp obviously manipulated him. Evie felt the blood drain from her face. The room started to spin, billion with a B. It wasn't real. She couldn't breathe. Her gaze darted from the furious siblings to the calm, implacable lawyer. Your father was certified of sound mind by 3 separate psychiatrists in the week before he signed this will. Marcus Finch stated coldly, "It is ironclad. She's a gold digger." A con artist, Victoria screamed, her elegant facade completely shattered. "We will contest this. We will drag her through every court in this state. You will not see a single dime of our family's money, you little witch." The insults barely registered. Evie was in a state of profound shock, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and terror. Mr. Henderson, Arthur Pendleton, had left her everything. His entire fortune. Why? For a cup of coffee. It made no sense. It was a curse, not a gift. Silence. Finch's voice boomed with an authority that cut through the hysteria. Marcus and Victoria, shocked by his tone, fell silent, though they were both breathing heavily, their eyes burning with hatred for Evie. Finch adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice dropping ominously. "A codicil, a condition attached to the inheritance." All eyes, including Evie's, snapped back to him. "The inheritance is not unconditional," Finch explained, looking directly at Evie, his expression unreadable. Mr. Pendleton added a final test. "A challenge that you and only you must complete. If you fail, or if you refuse to accept the challenge, the entirety of the estate reverts to Marcus and Victoria." Marcus let out a short, harsh laugh. A sliver of hope had returned to his eyes. "A test." "What kind of test?" Finch turned the page. Pendleton stipulated that before Miss Reed can inherit, she must prove she has the character and tenacity he believed he saw in her. His gaze locked with Evie's, pinning her to her seat. "The will is not the end of his test, Miss Reed. It is the beginning." The silence that followed Finch's announcement was heavier than before. It was a silence filled with calculation and renewed hope on one side of the table, and sheer, dumbfounded terror on the other. Evie felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind of an impossible choice whistling in her ears. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a cruel, confident smirk spreading across his face. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the familiar comfort of control. A test. A loophole. This was a language he understood. "Well, Alistair, don't keep us in suspense," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. What ridiculous hoop did my eccentric father devise for the waitress to jump through? Victoria, too, had composed herself, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. She looked at Evie with renewed contempt, sizing her up as an obstacle that would soon be removed. Finch ignored them. His attention focused solely on Evie. Arthur was a man who built his empire from nothing. He began his voice taking on a narrative tone. He valued hard work, integrity, and grit above all else. He came to believe, rightly or wrongly, that his wealth had insulated his children from these values. He paused, letting the implicit criticism land. Marcus's smirk tightened. Therefore Finch continued. The condition. For inheritance is not about money, but about character. Arthur owned many businesses, large and small. One of his last acquisitions, a purchase his family considered a sentimental folly, was a small independent city newspaper, the Chicago Chronicle. Evie knew of it. It was an old institution, a scrappy paper known for its deep dives into local politics and community stories. In recent years, however, it had fallen on hard times, unable to compete with the digital age. The Chronicle is currently failing, Finch stated bluntly. It's losing money. Readership is at an all-time low, and its staff is demoralized. Marcus has advised on several occasions to liquidate its assets and sell off the real estate. It's a financial black hole, Marcus interjected. A vanity project. It serves no purpose. Your father disagreed, Finch countered coolly. He believed it served a vital purpose for the city. And he has made it the centerpiece of his test. He turned his full attention back to Evie. Miss Reed, the condition is this: you are to be installed as the new publisher and acting chief executive officer of the Chicago Chronicle. You will have exactly 1 year. In that time, you must make the newspaper profitable again. You must increase its circulation by 25%. And you must, in the words of my client, make it something that matters again. The room fell silent. Evie's mind reeled. Publisher CEO. Her. A waitress who struggled to balance her own checkbook. She knew nothing about business, nothing about journalism, nothing about managing anything more complicated than a lunch rush. It was an impossible, absurd task. It was designed for her to fail. A low, genuine laugh escaped Marcus's lips. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated victory. "Oh, that is brilliant," he said, shaking his head in mock admiration. "Father, you old dog. A final, beautiful piece of corporate strategy. She'll run it into the ground in a month. 6 weeks, tops." Victoria added a smug smile playing on her lips. "Does she even know how to read a balance sheet?" "Darling," she said, her voice syrupy sweet and dripping with poison as she finally addressed Evie directly. "A balance sheet is not the same as a menu. There are no daily specials. The humiliation was a physical blow." Evie felt her cheeks burn. They saw her as a joke, a piece of trash their father had inexplicably picked up and that they now had to sweep away. For a moment, all she wanted to do was run. To flee the opulent office, the cruel, laughing faces, the impossible weight of a $4.8 billion dilemma. She could say no. She could walk away, go back to her life of aching feet and student debt. It would be easier, safer. But then she thought of Arthur Pendleton, Mr. Henderson. She thought of his lonely eyes, the way he'd said her name. He hadn't done this to be cruel. He hadn't set her up to be mocked by his horrible children. This wasn't a punishment. It was a message. He saw something in her, the same resilience that got her up for 6 a.m. shifts after studying all night, the same stubborn kindness that made her buy coffee for a man who offered nothing in return. He wasn't just giving her a test, he was giving her a chance to prove not just to his children, but to herself that she was more than a waitress. And something else stirred within her anger, a hot, righteous anger at the two smug faces across the table who assumed she was worthless because she didn't wear pearls or bespoke suits. They had been given everything and appreciated nothing. She had nothing and appreciated every small kindness. In that moment, the fight ignited in her. She lifted her chin, her gaze steady, and looked directly at Alistair Finch. She ignored the Pendletons completely, as if they were no more important than the expensive furniture. "What are the terms?" she asked, her voice surprisingly firm and clear. Finch raised an eyebrow, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You will be given full operational control effective immediately. The newspaper's existing accounts will be at your disposal for operating costs. You will be given a modest salary enough for living expenses drawn from the estate. You are not permitted to use any of the larger estate's funds to artificially prop up the paper. It must succeed or fail on its own merits. You will have access to your father's old office at the Chronicle building. All decisions are yours. I will act as the executor monitoring your progress against the stated goals. You have 1 year from today." "Do you accept these terms?" Marcus scoffed. "She's not seriously considering this." Evie took a deep breath. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But it was now overshadowed by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She thought of her art of the canvases under her bed that she never had the time or energy to paint. She thought of a life that wasn't about just surviving. This was the most terrifying thing she had ever faced, but it was also the first real opportunity she'd ever had. It was a tribute to the memory of a grumpy old man who had, for some unknowable reason, believed in her. She looked past Finch, her gaze landing on Marcus and Victoria, a silent challenge in her eyes. "Yes," Evie said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I accept." The smirk fell from Marcus Pendleton's face. The game was on. The Chicago Chronicle building was a relic from another era. A 5-story brick structure tucked away in a less fashionable part of the city. It smelled of old paper ink and a pervasive sense of defeat. The grandeur of its marble lobby was faded, the gold lettering above the entrance tarnished. It was a ghost of its former self, much like Arthur Pendleton had been. Evie's first day as publisher and CEO was a catastrophe. She walked in, wearing her same grey dress, feeling like a high school student on her first day of a terrifying new school. The newsroom, a vast open space filled with cluttered desks, fell silent as she entered. Dozens of eyes, suspicious, resentful and curious, turned to her. The news of the billionaire's bizarre will had already ripped through the city's gossip mill. They all knew who she was, the waitress, the usurper. The managing editor, a grizzled, cynical journalist named Robert Miller, met her at the door to what was now her office. He didn't bother to hide his contempt. "So you're the one," he said, not offering to shake her hand. "I've worked here for 30 years. I've seen publishers come and go, never seen one who was taking orders in a diner a week ago." The staff's hostility was a thick, suffocating blanket. They were loyal to the memory of Arthur Pendleton, but they were also professionals who saw her as an unqualified amateur, a joke. Worse, many were unofficially loyal to Marcus Pendleton, who had been their presumed future boss. Memos she sent went ignored. Meetings she called were met with sullen silence and folded arms. When she tried to understand the financials, the chief financial officer, a man clearly in Marcus's pocket, presented her with spreadsheets so dense and jargon-filled they seemed designed to confuse and intimidate. Within 2 weeks, things got worse. Marcus Pendleton began his campaign of sabotage. It was subtle at first, then brutally direct. 2 of the Chronicle's largest remaining advertisers, both companies with ties to Pendleton Industries, pulled their contracts without explanation. A top investigative reporter was poached by a rival network with an offer the Chronicle couldn't possibly match. Rumors began to circulate in the Chicago business community that the paper was on its last legs, being run into the ground by an incompetent novice. Evie was drowning. She spent her nights in Arthur's old office, a cavernous wood-paneled room filled with his books and personal effects. She'd sit at his massive desk, surrounded by circulation reports, showing a terrifying downward trend, and angry letters from creditors, and feel the weight of her impossible task crushing her. Tears of frustration and fear were a nightly ritual. She would stare out the window at the city lights and think about how easy it would be to quit. One night, feeling utterly defeated, she was about to pack it all in. She started looking through Arthur's desk, searching for a pen, but instead, she found a hidden drawer. Inside was not a business ledger, but a small, worn, leather-bound journal. It was Arthur's. His handwriting was a difficult, spidery scrawl, but as Evie began to read, a different portrait of the man she knew as Mr. Henderson began to emerge. He wrote about his frustrations with his children, his loneliness, his disillusionment with the world of corporate greed he had helped build. But mostly he wrote about the Chronicle. He'd bought it because it was the paper his own father, a steel worker, had read every day. He saw it as a voice for the voiceless, a check on the powerful. And tucked into the back of the journal were his notes on a story he had been personally investigating before his illness got too severe. It was a story about a series of chemical spills in a low-income neighborhood on the South Side. Residents were getting sick, their property values were plummeting, and no one was listening. The company at the center of it all was a chemical manufacturing firm called Omnichem. And as Evie dug deeper into Arthur's notes, she found the connection he had been searching for. Omnichem was a subsidiary owned through a complex web of shell corporations by Pendleton Industries. It was a bombshell. Marcus was effectively poisoning a neighborhood for profit, and Arthur knew it. This wasn't just a business challenge. It was a moral crusade left unfinished. A fire ignited inside Evie, burning away her fear and despair. This was it. This was how she would make the paper matter again. She went to Robert Miller, the cynical managing editor, and laid the journal and Arthur's notes on his desk. Arthur Pendleton was investigating this before he died, she said. Omnichem is poisoning people, and his own son is burying it. I want to finish his work. Miller looked at the notes, his eyes scanning the pages. For the first time, the cynical mask cracked. He was a newsman, and this was a real story, a dangerous career-making story. The Pendletons will bury us if we run this, he said, but there was a new spark in his eyes. They're trying to bury us anyway, Evie countered. What have we got to lose? This is why this paper exists, isn't it? To tell the stories no one else will. That was the turning point. Miller, seeing a glimpse of the old Arthur Pendleton's fire in this unlikely young woman, finally got on board. He assembled a small secret team of the few journalists who hadn't been swayed by Marcus's influence, a young, hungry reporter named Ben Carter, and a veteran photographer who had been with the paper for 40 years. They worked in secret late at night in Arthur's office. Evie transformed. She wasn't a CEO. She was a leader of an insurgency. She used her skills from the diner, not managing balance sheets, but managing people. She brought them coffee, listened to their frustrations, remembered their kids' names. She earned their trust not through authority, but through shared purpose. She organized clandestine meetings with terrified residents in the affected neighborhood, convincing them to go on the record. Ben Carter dug through property records and corporate filings, connecting the dots just as Arthur had started to. Marcus got wind that something was happening. The pressure intensified. An anonymous tip to the city's health department resulted in a surprise inspection that shut them down for a day over a minor infraction. Their internet service was mysteriously cut for 12 hours right before a deadline. But it only made the small team more determined. They were no longer just employees. They were a family united by a single mission. Evie felt more alive than she ever had, the exhaustion replaced by a thrilling, terrifying adrenaline. She wasn't just fighting for an inheritance anymore. She was fighting for Arthur's legacy, for a sick community, and for the soul of a newspaper. The final pieces of the story clicked into place, supported by leaked internal documents from a guilt-ridden Omnichem employee. They were ready. The headline was simple, stark, and devastating, and they were about to go to print. The basement of the Chicago Chronicle building was a cavernous, vibrating heart of iron and ink. The deafening roar of the old web press was an all-consuming force, a physical presence that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into Evie's bones. It was a sound of industry, of finality. There was no turning back now. Evie stood on the greasy metal catwalk, overlooking the machinery, flanked by Robert Miller and Ben Carter. Below them, a river of newsprint snaked through a labyrinth of rollers at dizzying speed. Robert, the grizzled editor, who had once viewed her with such contempt, now stood with his arms folded, a look of profound, nervous anticipation on his face. He had risked his 30-year career, his pension, everything he had built on the word of a waitress and the ghost of his old boss. Ben Young and vibrating with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, clutched a railing, his knuckles white. For him, this was everything the kind of story journalists spend their entire lives chasing. "It's louder than I remembered," Evie shouted over the din. Robert managed a grim smile. "That's the sound of the truth, kid. It's not supposed to be quiet." The first finished copies began to emerge, folded and cut, tumbling onto the conveyor belt. Ben scrambled down the stairs and snatched one, his hands trembling as he held it up for them to see. There it was, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the stark, haunting photograph of the sick child. The headline, a brutal accusation in bold black ink. Pendleton's poison. How a billion-dollar empire profits from a neighborhood's pain. It was real. They had done it. For a long moment, they just stared at the front page, the weight of their actions settling upon them. They hadn't just printed a story. They had fired a cannon shot directly at one of the most powerful families in Chicago. As the delivery trucks were loaded in the pre-dawn chill, an exhausted but wired team gathered in the newsroom. They drank stale coffee and waited for the city to wake up and read their story. Evie sent Ben out to a newsstand a few blocks away. He called her, 10 minutes later, his voice breathless. "Evie, they're not just buying it. They're standing in groups on the corner, reading it." Pointing at the headline. "It's working." By 7:00 a.m., the newsroom, usually a quiet hum of keyboards, sounded like the floor of the stock exchange. The phones began to ring, and they did not stop. The first call was from the mayor's office, a frantic chief of staff demanding information. Then came a call from a national news network in New York. Robert fielded that one, his voice regaining the confident, authoritative bark of his youth. Other calls flooded in a law firm offering to represent the residents of the South Side neighborhood pro bono. A tearful woman who claimed her husband, a former Omnichem employee, had died from a mysterious respiratory illness. An anonymous caller from within Pendleton Industries offering even more incriminating documents. The story was a wildfire. Evie stood in the middle of the controlled chaos, directing traffic, her voice steady. She saw the looks on the faces of her staff, the ones who had stayed, the ones who had believed. Their cynicism had been burned away, replaced by a fierce electric pride. They weren't just clocking in anymore. They were part of something that mattered. Meanwhile, in a penthouse apartment overlooking Lincoln Park, Marcus Pendleton was awakened by the frantic buzzing of his personal phone. It was his head of PR. "Marcus, we have a 5-alarm fire. Have you seen the Chronicle?" Marcus scoffed, rolling over. "That dead tree rag." "What about it?" "You're the front page. It's bad, Marcus. It's the Omnichem story." Annoyance turned to ice in Marcus's veins. He threw back the silk sheets and strode into his living room, barking at his smart home system to turn on the local news. His face stared back at him from the screen next to the devastating headline from the Chronicle. A reporter was standing live in the blighted South Side neighborhood, interviewing a weeping mother holding a copy of the paper. His carefully constructed world shattered in an instant. His first call was to Alistair Finch. "You will shut this down, Alistair," he roared into the phone. "You will sue that little tramp and her pathetic newspaper into oblivion for libel." Finch's voice was as cold and calm as a winter morning. "I cannot do that, Marcus. First, because the story appears to be meticulously sourced, and I suspect entirely true. And second, because as of this morning, a preliminary injunction has been granted. The estate of Arthur Pendleton, as the majority owner of the Chronicle, is legally protected from any interference from Pendleton Industries or its officers until the terms of the will are fulfilled." "Your father thought of everything." Marcus's rage gave way to a chilling realization. He was trapped. The waitress hadn't just stumbled into a lucky story. She had used his father's own weapon against him. The board meeting was convened for that afternoon. It was a bloodbath. The members who had once been his golfing buddies and yes-men now looked at him like he was a liability they had to cut loose. They grilled him about Omnichem, about the cover-up, about the catastrophic damage to the Pendleton brand. He blustered and lied, but the evidence bolstered by the new leaks the Chronicle was already publishing online was irrefutable. By 5 o'clock, with the company's stock in freefall, he had no choice. He tendered his resignation, his legacy not as a titan of industry, but as a disgraced fool outsmarted by a waitress. A week later, Evie walked through the mahogany doors of Finch, Covington & Crowe for the third and final time. The suit she wore was off the rack, but it fit perfectly. She moved with an assurance that came not from wealth, but from purpose. She entered the conference room to find Alistair Finch smiling and Marcus and Victoria looking like ghosts at a feast. Marcus was hollowed out, his expensive suit hanging on him like a costume. Victoria's face was pale and tear-streaked, her pearls looking gaudy against her profound misery. "Welcome, Miss Reed Finch," said his voice warm with respect. He gestured to a thick portfolio on the table. "The numbers are frankly astounding. Circulation has stabilized at a 300% increase. The paper is solidly in the black with a 6-month slate of new high-profile advertising contracts. You have met and exceeded every possible interpretation of the codicil. It is my great pleasure to inform you that, as of my signature on these documents, the entire estate of Arthur Elias Pendleton is yours. Congratulations." Evie looked at the documents, at the astronomical numbers that represented a fortune beyond comprehension. Then she looked at the broken siblings across from her. She felt no sense of victory, only the heavy weight of responsibility. She slid the portfolio back to the center of the table. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. Before we sign anything, I have some new terms to discuss." Finch leaned forward, intrigued. Marcus looked up, a flicker of confusion in his dead eyes. First, Evie began, her voice clear and strong. "I will not be taking personal control of the bulk of the assets. We are going to establish the Pendleton Foundation for Community Arts and Journalism. Its first act will be to acquire the Lake Forest mansion and convert it into a residential fellowship for struggling artists and investigative reporters. The foundation will be seeded with $2 billion from the estate." She thought of her own canvases under her bed, of the dreams deferred for rent money. "Second, at Pendleton Industries, I will be implementing an immediate company-wide profit-sharing plan and placing 2 elected employee representatives on the board of directors. The company's value comes from its workers, and they will share in its success. Third," she said, her gaze steady, "I will retain my position as publisher of the Chronicle. Its independence will be endowed by the foundation, ensuring it can never be silenced by corporate or political pressure again." Finally, she turned her full attention to Marcus and Victoria. The time for anger was over. "Your father's will wasn't about punishing you," she said, her voice softening. "It was about teaching you. He was a man who built things, and he was heartbroken that his children had never learned how. He left you each $1 million. The new foundation will match that sum for each of you, giving you $2 million apiece." A spark of the old greed flickered in Victoria's eyes. "But there is a condition," Evie added, channeling the spirit of their father. "You cannot invest it or add it to your portfolios. You must use it to build something. A business, a charity, anything you want. But you have to start it from scratch with your own 2 hands. You have to submit a business plan to the foundation's board. You have to learn the value of making something out of nothing." That was his real test. For all of us. She stood her part in this drama concluded. Alistair Finch rose with her, his eyes shining with an emotion that went beyond professional duty. He understood. He had seen Arthur's final desperate wish brought to life by the most unlikely of people. As Evie walked out of the opulent law firm and into the bright Chicago sunlight, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had faced down a billionaire's family, resurrected a newspaper, and exposed a rot at the heart of the city. She had inherited an empire, but her real inheritance was the lesson Arthur Pendleton had tried to teach his own children, that a legacy isn't what you are given, it's what you build and what you give back. Instead of taking the waiting Bentley, she started walking, heading not towards a mansion in Lake Forest, but back to the noisy, ink-stained newsroom of the Chicago Chronicle. She had work to do. Evelyn Reed's story reminds us that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in character. It started with a $1.25 cup of coffee and ended with the reshaping of an empire, all because one person chose compassion over indifference. She proved that you don't need a prestigious degree or a wealthy background to make a monumental impact. All you need is integrity, courage, and the willingness to see the humanity in others, even when it's hidden behind a grumpy exterior. Her journey shows that the greatest opportunities in life often come disguised as impossible challenges, and that honoring a legacy is more valuable than simply inheriting a fortune. What did you think of Evie's incredible journey? Do you believe she made the right choice in the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of unexpected kindness and dramatic twists moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to see it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will inspire and amaze you. Thank you for watching.